I'm always excited to have a meaningful chat on Dose of Depth, but there's extra excitement when our chat clashes with current events. In this episode, I'm excited to have one of my depth psychology buddies and my new friend back. Dr. Craig Chalquist is a former psychotherapist and the current academic program director of Consciousness, Psychology, and Transformation at National University. Since our last chat, he has formally secured his second PhD in philosophy and religion. Craig's heart is as big as his brain, and he is uniquely suited to help people sort through the deeper meaning of the climax of division and regression happening right now. We do not have to demonize individual people, but there are not two equal sides in what's occurring in this stage of human consciousness expansion. Everyone is playing their proper role, including those swept up into a culture of intolerance and abusive and threatening behavior. Their own wounds make them easy prey, and without a framework for self reflection, we cannot expect them to be able to be conscious of the deeper meaning of their attraction to this movement. A lot has happened in the last week, but the inspiration for our chat came from watching one of Craig's videos that he put out after the Republican National Convention had ended. I immediately told him, we have to have a chat about it. And then it went viral. Of course, going viral is subjective, but for someone who typically gets 300 to 600 views on his TikTok video, getting 147,000 is definitely going viral. He not only touched a nerve, he brought a sense of peace to many people, especially women victims of violence, when he assured them they weren't crazy for being triggered by the threatening political discourse that has coalesced into the identity of one of our political parties. But before we get to our chat, if you appreciate conversations like this, in addition to liking, subscribing, and sharing, please consider supporting me with a one time or monthly donation. I'll include the link for that. Craig isn't the first one to identify the abusive language and behavior that has infiltrated the persona and platform of one of our political parties. The first time I heard it was on Midas Touch Network. I'm a groupie. The conversation was about how Donald Trump's treatment of and attitude towards his own supporters resembled that of a domestic abuser. Just as many wonder why an abused woman stays with her abuser, I started wondering why people would stay with a movement that disrespects them so much. It's complicated, of course. What Craig has identified is how that behavior has now shaped one of our major political parties that targets its abusive and threatening language towards Americans who are not his supporters. Many people, especially survivors of domestic violence, are re experiencing the fear they felt in those past relationships, and at the same time, wonder if they are crazy for being so emotionally impacted by rhetoric that's not the same as actually living with their abuser. They're not crazy, says Craig, and you'll learn about that. Before we start our chat, I want to emphasize that we do not need to demonize anyone individually. Rather, we are called to gain a deeper understanding of what this means and how we transcend the situation. While domestic abuse transcends group labels, race, economic status, and political party, it is only one political party that has taken on the persona of an abuser and integrated it into its platform of policies. This is not true of the other party. And at the same time, there are individuals within both parties and outside parties that are abusive. Again, we don't need to demonize anyone. We need deeper understanding about the root, which is, of course, the patriarchal wound, and what role we can play to bring attention to the objective facts and overcome this culture of fear and intimidation in favor of getting back to kindness, a collective spirit, and commitment to save the planet. It is only the most powerful people, right wing billionaires who have a Christian nationalist fantasy, who benefit by our continued division and descent into the black hole of intolerance. It is only right wing billionaires who have this fantasy of controlling and ruling over us that benefits by the addiction some are trapped in of projecting their inner lack of self worth onto what is a growing list of others. So let's get started. Well, welcome, Craig. How are you?
Thank you. I'm really good. I'm glad to be here. How are you
I'm
doing?
I'm great. I know a lot has happened in the last week, and both of us are like really excited to have this conversation. So, and for my listeners, mostly viewers, many of you know sometimes I really write out long questions and to provide some context. And this is just something that really swept me up. So, I'm going to be reading long questions and then just unleashing Craig to go wherever he wants to go with it. So, anyway, so let's get right to it. I can't help but compare the situation of one of your videos going viral to the first thing that came up for me was the film Thelma and Louise, which was released in 1991. And it made me think about how Jung discerns between psychological versus visionary art. So,
Mm,
psychological art being you kind of know the moral of the story, nothing really surprising happens in reactions to the film. People like it, they relate to it, whatever. But visionary art is this something happens and the reaction to it that really isn't predictable and kind of transcends the intention of the director or the writer or whatever. And that is what happened with Thelma and Louise. So, just to set some context, I came of age in the 1980s, and it was felt as a time of possibilities. And women were breaking barriers and getting into places where they were not allowed to be before. And I was a feisty, active feminist, and I was studying finance. So I was used to being surrounded by men, and I didn't care. Like, I liked men, and men liked me too. And I was excited to chart my own course. And somehow, I didn't realize this until my midlife unraveling. I sort of ignored and brushed off what back then was also violent rhetoric. And there was this backlash against women like me. And I knew it was there because I bought the books. So Susan Faluti's book called Backlash: The Undeclared War Against American Women. And then there was another book that came out called Transforming a Rape Culture. And it was by Emily Buchwald, Pamela Fletcher, and Martha Roth. And for my listeners, I'll put those links in the description box. So I understood it intellectually, but I hadn't realized I was also absorbing it into my unconscious, but it just sat there for a while until my midlife unraveling. So I went on with my adventure. I did go see the movie, and I was like, oh my God, I loved it so much. Along, Alien with Sigourney Weaver, I was like, that was really empowering for me too. But for those people who don't know it, I'll put a link to that too. It's about two women, two girlfriends, and they're very different. One is feisty, she's kind of vulgar, and the other one is more passive and kind of like helpless. And that one is an abusive relationship. And she's like, I'm done. I need a break. So they go on this weekend trip. And the hopeless and helpless one, Louise, is played by Gina Davis. She was also naive. Actually, Brad Pitt was in this movie. I'm not sure if it
mm,
was his first movie. And she finds herself in this predicament when they're drinking at a bar, and she ends up shooting the drunk man who basically tried to force himself on her. And of course, it's self defense, but Thelma, played by Susan Sarandon, like quickly assesses the situation, and she's like, no one is going to believe us. We got to get out of here. Now, Harvey Keitel plays a really interesting character because he's like the lone quality man who actually like has some empathy, and he wants to bring them in peacefully, but the odds are stacked against them. And so that last scene where there's like many police cars chasing their convertible, and the I guess this would be considered a meme maybe today, but there's that scene where they literally are like, they drive off the cliff to their deaths, and they choose death over oppression. So that movie is one of many that is also in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry because it's considered culturally significant. And the film was empowering to a lot of women. And I remember the scene where the women are like, tell the semi truck driver, go, run, run, run. Then they blow up the truck. And so that fiery explosion is sort of like this buried feminine anger that like comes out with a vengeance. But what was more interesting was the response by male critics. They hated it.
mm,
They hated it. So here we go. We have this opposition of extreme responses of empowering to like now their fear is being triggered, right? So anyway, so that I came up because your TikTok video went viral for the same reason. right? So you were able to articulate something that is in people's unconscious, but is individual. And I want you to talk about is like some people thinking, am I crazy? Am I crazy? They feel kind of alone in how they're feeling about their reaction to certain things today. And you were able to articulate something for them. And what's interesting, what I think is breaking out now is not like anger or what you're like helping to unleash, but it's more like power to right this ship, power to heal this, to reconcile this split between the masculine and the feminine. And we're going to talk about that. So now we are in this new backlash against all symbols of power because progress is inclusive by nature, I would say. And consciousness raising is always about expansion and also love. But these things are very threatening to this old power structure, which only exists because of separation. So I guess that's how I wanted to open up. And I would love to start by you just sharing your personal experience of how it happened. Because again, you don't know, you just do these videos, you just share this stuff. And you're like that example of like, whoa, what did I touch? What did I say in just the right way? And so like, what happened? What was happening? And what made you decide to do the video or the series of videos? There's some kind of tipping point and you were swept up and felt called to do something. So yeah, let's just start with that and tell the story.
Thanks. So we just had our Republican National Convention, and like a lot of people, I didn't watch the whole thing. It was too disturbing. And so, especially with my background, one part of my background is I spent 6 years as a domestic violence counselor, and the other part is 18 years of violence growing up in a home where my dad was a batterer and never got arrested for it. So, with that background, I see things going on politically, particularly on the right, because they're the ones who are identifying with this kind of violent rhetoric and implied threats. They're using the word vengeance all over the place, retribution, things like that. And those of us with this background understand that these are deliberate threats. So, I don't know how many thousands of times I've heard stuff like this politically, and I thought it's just like batterers talk. I saw it at home. I saw it in my men's groups. I've seen it in police reports countless times. And so I thought, well, I think what I'm going to do out of disgust for this rhetoric, because no one seems to be commenting on this, is I'm going to do maybe, I don't remember how long it was, like 8 minutes or something. I'm going to do a little video pointing out some parallels between this violent rhetoric on the right, these threats, and the talk and style and behavior of men who batter women. I'm going to make the whole connection explicit, and I'm going to give examples from the Duluth power and equality, power control wheel, and then the equality wheel. I went through both of them. So the power and control wheel talks about this kind of syndrome where men seek to control and threaten women. We all domestic violence counselors use it as a basic model, and it has expanded into, it's been modified and changed and updated and all that. So that's what I did. And as of this morning, the video was up to 147,000 views,
I
and
checked it.
and it's slowing down a bit now. I expect it might pick up as we get closer to the election, but we'll see if that happens or not. But so I guess the triggering event was just seeing some clips from all that chest thumping going on the Republican side of things, and just going, oh, for God's sake, just grow up, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and then after that, you know, obviously it started sort of going viral, but what did you find in the comments that then made you decide like, whoa, I need to do more? Like people, what were they asking or what were they sharing? Like what were the themes that caused you to say, well, here's video number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and you just kept going?
The one comment I saw the most that continues to be the case, probably 95% of the comments are from women, maybe more. And the overwhelming majority of them are saying, I had these fears going back to 2016, right?
Mm.
I had these fears. I was told mostly by men that I was overreacting.
Mm.
Um, because of something I said in the video, they were linking it to post-traumatic stress from abuse by batterers, abusive men. And so women were making the connection in the comments and saying, I thought it was just me. And I thought, okay, I want to follow up with this. I'm going to do one video right off the bat that says, you're not crazy. You're actually reacting to a real thing that's going on. We need to listen to you and take you seriously. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. And the second thing is that as a group, women are powerful in this country if you get together. And so there's
Mhm.
170 million women in this country right now. So I wanted to emphasize that as well. And I read, by the way, I read this morning that there was a gathering of white women in support of Kamala Harris, and they broke Zoom. And I was
I
like,
know.
see, that's where we need to go, right?
Yeah, well, it was amazing because the night before, it was Black women that got
Yeah,
together on Zoom, and they had like 40 plus thousand, and they needed to call the CEO actually to like allow them all of that. And then you're like, holy crap, that's amazing. And then the next night, it's white women. And it's
yeah.
over what is it? Was it over 100,000 people on Zoom? So you're right. And a couple of things come up for me that I know you're going to talk about examples from the wheel, but these are coming up for me now. One of them is you said something really important, which is when women collectivize, just like when workers collectivize, they're very powerful. So one of the techniques of an abuser would be to keep women from
Yep.
coalescing and collectivizing with other women so that they think they're alone. And then the other thing that comes up for me is, for how long have we had this thing going on where people who are called snowflakes, right? So that's another technique, right? Abuser will use is to make you feel like, oh, you're overreacting. And of course, women have been told this forever. It's in your head. You're overreacting. Like, I don't understand. What are you so upset about? And it's really interesting to see that come full circle as who really are the snowflakes, right? Like who really is threatened by women's power. And
Projection.
I never understood, like going back, I never understood like part of my background as an activist was for park systems. And
Mm.
so one of the ways you were denigrated as someone pro environment was as a tree hugger. And I was like, isn't that good? And then I thought about like bleeding heart liberal. I thought, isn't there like a famous image of Jesus like holding a heart, a bleeding heart?
Yeah, Sacred Heart. Yeah.
I'm like, isn't that good? So it really is interesting how this really is climaxing in a really ridiculous and almost like a caricature way. Anyway, so great. So whenever you have like a specific example, that's great. So okay, so we have to acknowledge that something has shifted since we last spoke about this, right? Because that was before President Biden bowed out of the race. And again, who could foresee what would be unleashed in the form of that collective energy around Kamala Harris? And the shift in energy has not only shown up as volunteers, white women for Harris, Black women, oh, Black men. There was also a Black men Zoom account,
Yep.
and they raised $1 million, I think, that
That's
night.
right.
And
Yep.
so, like everyone, voter registrations, volunteer activation. So I think that because of this, that people do really need a framework to understand the deeper thing that's going on so that we can have some consciousness about what the opposition represents and what's trying to be worked out, and to also personalize it less and make it more about like this collective. So, you already addressed this about the comment about women feeling like they're crazy and sort of what's going on in your feed. So I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is as an activist in the 20s and trying to get other women to consider running for political office, we had to explain to women that the personal is political
Yeah.
and the political is always personal. And I used to have to explain it as like, even when you brush your teeth, there are some kind of laws that impact, is there allowed to be poison in your toothpaste or not? Right. So everything,
Yep.
and then it's also the same with the conscious and the unconscious, that the personal unconscious is the collective unconscious. It makes up the collective unconscious. So you really can't separate that. And so I feel like what you did was you took this framework of the wheel, both wheels, and we're going to talk more about that. And those wheels sort of apply to, like, you use them for personal situations to help personal people or maybe smaller groups of men, and you took it and you applied it to more of a collective situation, and how this party has taken on this identity and persona and is really the symbol of a giant abuser, basically. So again, I'm going to share links to those wheels, but maybe this would be a good place where you could go through some of the aspects of the power and control wheel that you think are most relevant and that will help people to be able to see this outside of themselves. So, gaslighting is a great place to start, because I didn't understand what that meant until I identified it in one aspect of my marriage. I was not in an abusive marriage. This is why, we don't have to demonize individual people. It's just like part of how I don't know, just part of how we're taught, right? And so, but I did identify it. And then I was like, oh, now I can see that outside of me as more of a collective force. So anyway, so just helping my listeners and viewers relate to what you're talking about by using the aspects on the wheel and then sharing anecdotes or specific sharing stories to help sort of bring it to life for them.
Sure. So as you're talking, there's two spokes or sectors of the wheel that it has eight of them. So eight basic tactics that men use to control women. And the wheel's been expanded beyond heterosexual relationships to all kinds of other ones too, since it came about in the 80s. But there's two spokes that or sectors that came to mind just now when you were mentioning that. One, emotional abuse, and the wheel doesn't use the term gaslighting because it hadn't become popular yet, although it was in circulation. But one of the classic techniques of a batterer is to pretend that the abuse doesn't exist, and then when it's complained about, to make it her fault.
Mm.
And so we're seeing this on the political scene, right? So the Republican Party is now blaming Democrats for the fact that someone took a shot at Donald Trump. So this is a very consistent dynamic with abusive men. We see it all the time and confront them about it in batterer intervention groups. It's one of the most consistent traits of batterers is to be abusive and then to blame somebody else for it. So that's using emotional abuse. And the wheel gives examples like putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, things like that. The examples aren't comprehensive. There can be hundreds, but the wheel just lists a few. And then another part of this that's directly relevant is called using male privilege. And so making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, being the one to define men's and women's roles
Mm.
are example of that. And the thing about male privilege too is those of us who have it often don't know that we do. And so we assume everybody else has the same opportunities that we do, which of course is wrong on all kinds of levels, including the research that backs up that it's wrong. But so there, we talk about white privilege sometimes. It's a related thing. And male privilege is a term we taught in our groups to our men. You guys all have this. You're going to get plenty of examples. Um, so those are two examples. But what I found when I actually went back to the wheel, which I hadn't looked at for a while, and I should mention there's two wheels. There's an equality wheel that shows how relationships are supposed to work. But this is the power and control wheel we're talking about. Every single sector applies to what's happening politically right now. So using coercion and threats. Many times our men had been they had been arrested for their violence, and so they didn't want to go back to jail or prison, and so they would do more implied threats. So, you don't want to make me angry, or wait and see what's going to happen to you, and things like that. So, those of us who do this counseling and who grew up with those kinds of threats recognize this immediately. We don't fall for it at all. Using economic abuse, that's one of the items on the wheel. So, there's huge examples of that. I mean, the budget deadlocks, playing chicken with the national budget, even though it negatively impacts millions of Americans every time it happens. Using children is another batterer tactic.
Mm.
So if you remember when Trump was in power before, and all the immigrant kids who were in cages and separated permanently from their families, that might be an example. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. So we talked about that already a little bit. Um, Making light of the examples that the wheel gives, making light of the abuse, not taking her concerns seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for it, saying she caused it. And another one I'll mention too is using isolation. So,
Mm.
um, think about this on the national scene, right? Close the border, build the wall, and all that. Um, so, yeah, everything on the wheel basically applies to the current politics that we're talking about right now.
Well, and there are so many other examples that came up, just things that are so sinister. So, for example, we know that this is old stuff being recycled, but there's something so much more cynical and sinister about it right now. I mean, we're going backwards, right? And so I'm not going to give him credit, but a younger person funded by right-wing billionaires, Christian nationalists, who is supposed to be on college campuses, sort of, pulling young people into this sort of rigid going backwards framework. I saw a video where, young women, we know back in the 50s, there were actually handbooks that told women what made them happy, right, to serve a certain role. So we've been doing that forever, but like today women are so, I mean, I don't think in the end they're going to fall for it, but they kind of do sometimes. And so in this like rally, there was a young woman who was graduating from college, and she raised her hand. She's like, I'm going to be a doctor. And what's his face, who I'm not going to say his name, he said, oh, you know what I want you to do? I want you to go hold a baby.
Mm,
And I want you to realize that that's what you're supposed to do.
mm,
And I thought, wow. For part of me thought, what would I do? I'd like flip that person off. But those women are there. And so, those men have a sneaky way of like saying, oh, your role is so important. I'm going to put you up on this pedestal. Anytime somebody says I idolize their pedestal, no, 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 no. That's dangerous. Like danger zone, because there's a projection going on. And once you don't meet that, how they define something as ideal, so it's really sinister. And then the other thing I think that's important to say is that, in the 80s and 90s, it was really popular for even some men, good men, to say, if women ruled the world, everything would be fine. That's not true. Now, back in the day, maybe because women were trained to be the relationship oriented people, and that was all, projected onto them. That's not true. There are many women in power who are as hungry as men for power and who are very misogynistic, and they don't care about taking women's rights away, like Marsha Blackburn down in, I don't know where she is at. Though those women, it's not so much women and men, it's the masculine and feminine. And it's not the masculine as it should be, it's the toxic masculine. It's the extreme one-sided masculine. The masculine is good, it's a partner to the feminine. So, oh, and using children. Right. So supposedly, people who sort of use children in a way where they're about child predators, but they're really not. But if they just put up a yard sign that says "Save the children," it tugs on people's heartstrings, and they don't go the next step to find out, oh, what do they mean by that? So that side's, policies is often couched in language that is the exact opposite of what the policy is. So yeah, so there's lots of examples, and I think what's really great about the wheel is we know this, and the thing that really was also interesting in our conversation is you said that when the men, violent men that you worked with would be part of this program for a year, that if they finished it, that they became more conscious because you said, and I've been saying this to people because you really shifted my thinking that you said men, and let's say the Republican Party, those men and women, they know what they're doing. So an abuser knows, he knows he's stalking, he
Yep.
knows he's controlling, but he doesn't necessarily know why. And so that there is hope, right? So we're going to talk about this, like what needs to happen on a collective level to heal. But so you have experienced men healing once they could relate to what was in their unconscious that caused them to hurt people, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, mhm.
We did numbers on it at one point at one of the counseling centers I worked at, and so we had a 93, I think it was about 90 percent success rate. And what that means is of the men who completed the program, the year-long program, whether they did it all at once or whether they had more incidents, went back to jail, came back to us, and then finished, 93% never reviolated their probation. So those are pretty good indicators that we were doing what we should have been. We were working with, we did a lot of work around emotional maturity and trying to grow up the men, because it's a hallmark of all of these abusive men that they emotionally never grew up. And so
Yeah.
we've got emotional, anywhere from 2 to 6 year olds running around in adult bodies that are 40 and up, right?
Yeah. There is where I'm from, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, there is a wonderful center called Alma Center, and they work with violent men and ex-offenders in much the same way. And I used to help them raise money for a project that was called Men We Love. And what was so beautiful about it is we raised money by selling pages where people could honor the men they loved. And they got a photo shoot and they talked about it. So it was kind of like I don't know, this sort of giving a different picture of what good and healthy men look like. So I assume for some of those men, then that I mean, part of their journey is self-acceptance, right? So
Mhm.
when you begin to like have compassion for yourself, then you don't hurt other people. You have
Yeah,
compassion for them too.
that's certainly part of it. They
Yeah.
all of them have a scared boy inside them too, who
Yeah.
himself got emotionally and or physically abused. And so when they're out of touch with that boy, then the boy possesses them. They become
Yeah.
the boy. And so we would teach them to stand back from it and to feel compassion about the abuse their fathers inflicted on them.
Yeah.
Um, and then
So
that would be the beginning of the transformation.
So that's what's going at a collective level. So I think, oh, here. So I think this is a good time to create a picture for what the opposing framework looks like. So we're all familiar with this power and control, which really is maintained through some kind of violence, whether it's violent rhetoric, violent economic policies, violent policies regarding the environment, exploiting the environment, all of that. But what does the other look like? And when we don't have a vision for what the other is, right, then what do we work towards? Um, so I think and the equality wheel is a nonviolent approach to relating. And so, what I was thinking about was this concept of conscious versus unconscious competence, if you've ever heard of that. So, some people are like naturally some way, they're naturally talented in something, but they're not always aware of like why and what exactly am I doing that makes me so good at that. And so, once you become more conscious about this good trait you have, then you're actually able to articulate it for others, and or you're aware of what exactly you're modeling. And so for example, I had this experience recently on Twitter, and it was an older woman who called herself a Christian and said she lived according to Christ. So I put reflection questions out there like, what are you doing this? What inspires you? And when people say living like Christ, I don't let them off the hook. I'm like, what does that mean for you? Like, what does that mean? And so we had a little back and forth, and she and it was interesting. Her answer was like, "Well, I don't judge non-Christians who do bad behavior because of blah 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 blah." And I said, "Well, I don't trust Christians who engage in bad behavior because they're unconscious of what they're projecting onto others." And that wasn't sitting well with her. And I ended up telling her that my when my son was in middle school, he just told me this recently. I didn't know. He was bullied because even in middle school, he was an atheist.
Mhm.
And he was mercilessly bullied by Christian children. And when
Yeah.
I shared this with her, she said, "Oh, well, you can't hold them accountable." But right before that, she said, "You need to hold non Christians accountable for their bad behavior." So I thought, oh, well, that doesn't really make sense. And then I said, "Oh, I was hoping for some empathy." And she said, "I can't feel empathy for something I haven't experienced."
Mm.
And I said, "Oh, well, empathy just requires imagination. Empathy doesn't mean you've experienced something. Empathy means you can imagine a situation where you might feel the same way you feel. And so you just find a way to relate to the person." And then she didn't respond. So that made me post something about empathy requires imagination, not that you have direct experience. So I guess that got me thinking about some people who are naturally nonviolent and confused by people who are exhibiting these behaviors. These like, why do you say things like that? Why are you mean? Why do you call people a snowflake? Because they're triggered by your violent behavior. And so people who aren't maybe conscious of, why are they confused by the other people? Instead, sometimes we're triggered, so that what can we be more conscious about so we can respond more effectively instead of reacting emotionally. So, and I say that for those of us who can self-reflect, this is our time to go deeper and to disarm our own complexes and triggers so that we can see things and be more clear-headed about it. So it also reminded me of a recent chat I had with Cher Griffin. She's my resident misfit, and so I'm going somewhere with this. But she got me seeing. Our last chat was about peace building, and so she got me to see that the work that I'm doing is peace building, and I was like, "What? I'm doing peace building work?" And then I was like, "Oh, I am." So I didn't realize it. So I feel like people often need we need a leader, we need an organization, we need a movement to sort of lead us. When really it's the opposite, right? Jung's saying the fate of humanity will depend upon the self-reflection of individuals. And so, how can we help people not how can we empower them, right? So we take this wheel and it's very academic and therapists do that. But how can we take that and know every day we're making choices and all those choices are a pivot towards consciousness expansion or not, or we're standing by. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that's kind of where my mind meanders.
Yeah, to take a couple of things from that, there's something I see a lot on the left politically in this country, which is a deep fear of acknowledging one's own aggression. And so the
Ooh,
Republicans carry that for the left.
that's so good.
Just as in relationships, like I've often seen examples of absolutely brilliant women who were raised in such a way that they're out of touch with their own brilliance. And so they go and find a partner who carries that for them and who might be somebody who's really smart. But that person is holding something that they should own, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some years ago, way back when George W. Bush was president, I got thrown into this big email distribution. It was a bunch of people on the left who were therapists and healers and alternative medicine practitioners and people like that. Lots of Californians in the mix, and they were saying they wanted to do a couple of things. They wanted to get together collectively and send good energy to George W. Bush to help him be more reflective, and then they were going to follow up with a letter. And so my I can't remember if I knew I was replying to the entire group or not, but I replied because they invited me into this. And I said, I just have a question. How come you're not sending energy to his political opponents?
Ooh.
And they immediately dropped me. So that's the kind of thing that I think gets us in trouble. Those of us who want to be empathic and progressive, we forget that we've got a fiery side that needs to be acknowledged and even made use of. So, and of course, Jung talked all about this, the shadow, things fall into the shadow and all that. But they shouldn't stay there. They should be made use of somehow. So,
Oh, I love that because yes, that's why that's why I am all about like let's not we shouldn't demonize people, especially on an individual level, because also
yeah,
people get swept up in these collective forces and it becomes bigger than them where they're and if there are people who can't self-reflect, that's where they are. But if I can, boy, I better start reflecting about what I'm projecting onto those people.
yeah,
So we can other too. And right. And so we can get swept up in that. But that, what I wrote down was anger. And
yeah.
so one of the things that I know I hide from is anger.
Hmm.
And because as a child, my wound is I wasn't allowed to have negative emotions.
Right.
I
Yeah.
just couldn't. My mother got to have them all. And I remember this moment. Oh, this is so devious. I remember this moment. Like she used to like hyperventilate in front of my sisters and I about how we just, were torturing her and we caused her so much pain. And my stepfather was in there saying, look what you did to your mother. And we're kids. Like, what? And so one day I tried it on her. I was so mad and I started like breathing in because I knew she was faking. And she looked at me and she goes, don't even try it. And so, what did I become really good at? Controlling my emotions. And
Hmm.
actually, communication and emotional intelligence became kind of a preoccupation. And I was always struggling with, like, why doesn't my former husband understand me? There must be something in the way that I'm communicating. But I was always just trying to do it in the proper way, not knowing that I really needed to unleash my own anger in a healthy way, of course. Otherwise, it was going to be unleashed one way or another. And so I'm glad you bring up because I do not want people to misunderstand what we're trying to communicate. We're trying to describe dynamics that don't belong. There's not an individual person who's responsible, although there are people who are exploiting what's going on
Yeah.
intentionally. So there are some bad people out there, but they're people with power. And the
Yeah.
people who are swept up are sort of victims of abuse in their own way.
Part of the divide and conquer strategy too is to, and it plays right into what we're talking about, is to get people to fight with each other instead of, you know, doing some kind of good trouble where it really counts. And there's a term activists sometimes use called horizontal aggression or horizontal hostility. And you see this all the time on the left where they start fighting with each other,
Hmm.
right? About what they're
Yeah.
wearing or what they're eating or whatever it is, right? And it's completely self-destructive. And one can understand where it comes from because it's less scary to fight with each other, all of whom are more or less on the same page with values, than it is to fight with these hugely abusive people out there.
Yeah.
But it's really counterproductive. A friend of mine who has been the mayor of a small town in California uses an often described term, the circular firing squad on the left, right?
Yeah, I've
So we're
heard
good
this.
at shooting at each other instead of, you know,
Yeah. And now it's interesting because now that's happening on the other side. Because once you become rigid, then it's a competition to see who is more rigid, and who's left. It reminds me of the movie Northman. I don't
mm,
know. Oh, I like that I'm bringing that. That's where my mind is going. Did you see that movie?
mm,
I'm not. Yeah, it was out in the. Oh, it's really good because basically, bottom line. It really is about the patriarchal wound, but bottom line, no one wins. So there's this scene in the end, and there's fire behind them, and it's sort of a man who has the righteous position in this case, and he's fighting the bad guy, and he sends off. Don't remember. I can never remember the actress's name who's in Queen's Gambit. She's fantastic. She plays a really important role in there, and she in this the kind of it's really interesting. I think about what you said about the hero. There isn't one hero. Actually, there's not a hero because he ends up also being killed, but but she is pregnant with twins that represent, there's some really interesting imagery that represents the reconciliation. There's a boy twin, like it's a set of girl and boy, and she goes off, and we don't know where that goes, but there's a death, and the death is this man who takes up the mantle, and then the one who represents this violent patriarchy, and they end up killing each other at the same time. So there's this image of a sword going in one and the other gets decapitated, and for me I was like, there you go, that's the natural consequence of patriarchy,
Hmm.
without with and capitalism without guardrails and that sort of rigid extremist viewpoint. But out of that, oh, so right now this is all about working it out, and it's about healing, and we're going to get there by the end of this conversation. And so here she is, and she has been impregnated with this new reconciliation of, it's represented by the twins, the girl and the boy. So oh, well, that makes sense now to go to myths. So I feel like that imagery. So let's talk about how the great myths, Greek, Roman, biblical, whatever, the big stories that can help us detach from the overwhelm and of the times that we're living in. So we can see the larger context, and we also might be able to see our role. So our role could be an agitator. Our role is maybe a victim. Our role is like the role that I'm playing is just getting people to think. And so, what is happening is not about a literal end of days, right? But it's really about the ending of one way of being human. And so, another book I'll put the link to is Robin Robertson's book, Beginner's Guide to Revelation, where he looks at the biblical book of Revelation through a depth psychology lens. I think it's really empowering as opposed to like frightening, like, oh, the world is going to end, there's going to be a nuclear war. Like, no, it's a psychological battle is what's happening. So I'll put that in there. But maybe, you're so good with myths, so go wherever you want to go about this. And then, and maybe you can even start with, like, many people assume we've always had this split between masculine and feminine, and we haven't. And there are also myths about how at one time there was a reverence, and the union between masculine and feminine, and even sexual union between men and women, was like sacred. It was seen as sacred, and having, sex with the sacred prostitute was about getting closer to God, and all of that. And then we had this split. And so circling back, part of it is circling back to this like reintegrating and rebirth and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, whatever myths you think are helpful or your favorite or that are relevant here.
I'm often struck when I study myth by how fluid everything is about gender, about how the binaries aren't rigid. And
Hmm.
a god like Loki, who's male in one myth, is feminine in another, and Dionysus is a good example of that. And this is all over the world, all kinds of mythic figures. So that's one thing to note about myth, that it doesn't recognize this rigid difference between the two. And another lesson from myth all across the world, I'm thinking of an African myth in particular about a hero who saves a village from a monster, and then they become envious of him and start trying to kill him. And he eventually just leaves. He's like, enough of this hero business. And there's a lot of myths that are highly critical of the hero. Campbell doesn't touch on any of them, but yeah, and there are myths that he talks about that are about the hero's journey and
Mhm.
individuation and all that, Percival. But for ancient peoples especially, they always thought of the hero figures as dangerous. Look at Gilgamesh, cutting down entire forests and raping goddesses and all kinds of stuff. And Cuchulain, extremely dangerous. Heracles killed his whole family. I mean, these are really menacing figures. And, but here in the States, we've got a hero complex. We idealize the hero and
Yeah.
we forget that every hero is also a monster. That's why the two are always found together. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. I think about that's important about myth. It bears on this. But another thing comes up for me too. I teach Gnosticism, which is an esoteric path that started around the time of Jesus, probably a bit earlier. And the Gnostics are some of the original people of the Eastern Mediterranean saying that God is within us, the way older traditions do in other
Mhm.
parts of the world, like India, for instance. So some Gnostics were Christians, some not, but they started retelling the stories out of Genesis. And I think that what they have to say speaks to us. So their Eve isn't passive, for instance. So there's a story in which Adam is created and Eve is around too. She's directly linked to Gnostic goddesses like Sophia in ways that the male figures aren't directly linked. And so at one point, Adam gets created and he's just kind of laying there on the ground, not moving. And Eve takes pity on him and she gives him some of her spark, some of her spiritual power. And this is what animates Adam. And so I wanted to just read a very brief piece from a Gnostic text called On the Origin of the World.
Oh, good.
And this is just a few lines. When Eve does this for Adam in On the Origin of the World, it says, when Eve saw Adam cast down, she pitied him. And she said, Adam, live, rise upon the earth. Immediately her word became a deed. For when Adam rose up, he opened his eyes. Interesting symbol. And when he saw her, he said, you will be called the mother of the living because you are the one who gave me life.
Mm.
And so there's all these great Gnostic heroines. Oria or Noria, she's called different things, is another one. When in Gnostic stories about her, when the ark that Noah builds, the first ark, is under construction, she wants to go aboard and look around. And Noah says, no women allowed. No feminine beings at all allowed, right? So Noria has this fiery breath that she breathes on the ark and she burns it down. And so that forces Noah to build a second ark. And then she comes around again and says, I'd like to see what you're doing here. And he's like, come on aboard.
Oh,
He
oh
learned his
yeah.
lesson, right?
I love that. Well, that makes me think of what is her name? Rosemary Ruther Radford, who wrote Women and Redemption. And so, what many people fail to appreciate is that, the working out of Christian doctrine didn't happen one day. I
Yeah,
mean, there was, and basically, Jesus never asked for doctrine, right? You just like
yeah,
share the good news about this idea of redemption. And so she tracks the sort of, I mean, feminist voices that were there. And it wasn't overnight that we got sort of these views, right? These rigid views of the patriarchal God. That, I mean, it could be forced on some people, but really, you can't force everybody. And so there was this transition, and many of the first churches were built on the ruins of goddess temples. And where the heck did Mary come from? Do you not realize she's the mother of God? Like, I mean, she is the mother of God, right? When I think about, the Garden of Eden, and I think about, okay, we have the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, right? And so what did that mean that she was the one who bit from the apple, and the serpent, of course, was the articulation of goddess before there was a word goddess, so that's the symbol of the feminine and transfer, I mean, death, rebirth, all of that. But she's the one who has the courage to bite of the tree of knowledge. And really, what was that about? It was about, oh, you don't get to just be children anymore.
yeah,
You have to build a consciousness of right and wrong. And so, well, we don't like that. We want to go back to Eve. We want to go back to childhood. We want to go back to the womb, all of that. So, so I think like that rigidity and that reductionism is going to swallow itself up and hopefully birth, more a more expansive, Edward Edinger says, a new God image, not being God, but this new image that coalesces all the stuff that's happening below the surface right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I love it. Oh, and also, oh, I like that you said the hero as dangerous. Because yeah, oh, I wish I could remember the name of superhero movies. I love them because I think there's a lot more going on than, some Jungian film people think, oh, there's nothing in, sort of mass-minded films. And I disagree. I think there's a lot in there. But one of them, and I can't remember the name, but I do think maybe Chris Hemsworth was in it. Um, the whole, you're going to appreciate this. The whole point of that film was that there is no hero. It is the people that are the hero. And so there's a point in the film where he does help collectively with other superheroes, like save kind of the day. And he has the option to sit on the throne, and he sits on it, and you think he's settling in, and he's like, nope, I'm not doing it for you. Don't project that onto me. He doesn't say that, but don't project that onto me. This is you. It actually is a really beautiful superhero film that somebody like you would be like, oh my gosh, there's so much in the film, but it's entertaining, for most people. So I think, yeah, I think basically what we're doing is just projecting the responsibility onto a single person. Save us, please. No,
Yeah,
we have to do the saving ourselves.
I was mentioning in one of those videos in TikTok that there's a scene in the third Dune novel where there's a blind preacher who is coming in from the desert, and he preaches to the crowd every day, and he's really wonderful and wise and critical of the nobility of Dune and all this. And at one point as he's preaching, there's a woman in the crowd who speaks for many who were present, and she uses a word that means Messiah or Savior, and she calls out to him, Mahdi, help us. And so although he can't see with his physical eyes, he points a finger directly at her, and he says, "You are the only help that remains." And so I emphasize that in my work and the videos I put up. I mentioned at one point the need to organize. Here's where I possibly come into disagreement with Jung. I do respect and agree with his emphasis on doing one's individual work, but individual work isn't enough. We've been doing individual work since we were a species, and probably before that.
Yeah.
So it's necessary, but it's not enough. We have to organize. We have to get together and collaborate and dream together and fight together.
Well, yeah, well, think about how, the modern feminist movement in last century happened. Much of it was sparked because of Betty Friedan's book. And what did she do in the book? She brought together stories of individuals, and
Mm.
that ignited this I'm not alone. So it has to be both and. There's not an
Yeah,
or. And maybe because of the time that Young was, he saw like the devastation of the collective, right?
yeah. I mean,
That he,
communism and Hitlerism and all that. Yeah,
so it probably made him like overcompensate and put a lot of responsibility back on the individual. And maybe that's where that hero, I don't know, maybe that's why that took hold for some reason. And
it's a
now,
very it's a very heroic psychology and a
yeah.
very male privilege psychology too in some ways. But
Which is funny because it's supposed to be about the feminine, right? Carl
yeah,
Jung's psychology is psychology of the feminine, but he can't get away from that masculine.
well, I mentioned this too in videos that I've done and also presentations. One of the reasons I hesitate so often to go into some of these topics is because I'm not the expert, women are,
No.
right?
Yeah.
And so Jung kind of made himself the expert on feminine psychology, and the rest of us are like, nah.
Oh yeah, that whole thing with the animus too. When I was like, this is not my experience. Don't tell me this is my experience. And
Yeah,
oh, I forget the author, the Jungian analyst, a woman who basically chronicled the development of that theory. And I was like, yeah, we're getting there. we're getting there, right? So yeah. So I think it makes sense to sort of, close out our chat. I don't know, maybe there's another chat we have to have, talking about creativity, because our personal unconscious seeks to create. The collective unconscious seeks to expand consciousness through creating whatever. And our creativity always circles back to something that went wrong. Like whatever our original wound is involved in our creativity, because the purpose of the creativity, I think, is to be in service to humanity, not just your personal self. So of course, as we're expand our own unconscious, um, many of us get swept up in new thoughts, ideas, connections, podcasts, artistic expressions, businesses, whatever it is. And I think there is a lot of that happening. But going back to what you're saying about collectivizing, I think there's not enough attention being paid to all these various really wonderful things that are going on at the local grassroots level, and more attention has to go to the exciting ways that people, for example, there is a city someplace that decided to give uh, poor people $1,000 a month.
Hmm.
And some people assumed, oh, they're just going to waste it on whatever. What are those assumptions, that are wrong about our instincts? We have both kinds of instincts, right? And that they have found that that has been amazing. And it has contributed to the collective, to probably reduction in crime, peace, less stress. And they have watched how have people, and they allowed them to spend that money however they will, and that they have spent it on housing, on healthcare, and on, really good things. So there's all sorts of things going on that are examples that need to come up to the service and can help contribute to whatever the new paradigm, shift is going to be. Um, so also, let's see, what was I going to say? Finding our role. So one of the things I'm encouraging people is not only to self-reflect, but that to find the role. So this is what you're not keep it personal, but what is the role that I'm supposed to play? Not just keeping my insights to myself. Obviously, if I show up in the world in a new way, that has a butterfly effect, but to be more conscious competence about like what role can I play that will help in this healing. I don't need to be an expert about it. So, and I also think about like my writer friend JD Edwin wrote a fantasy series, and the first book is called Headspace. And she intentionally doesn't have a hero. Her heroes are kind of like unlikely heroes. They're just regular people. And I think what's really interesting about her story is they don't really know what they're doing. They're almost accidental heroes. And in that way, they become empowered and sort of more conscious of what they're doing. And also, she writes in a non binary way. So if you've never read a book in non binary with no he or she, it's really an interesting challenge and it makes you realize how trained we are to categorize people, even those of us who are open to non binary. It's so automatic. But that's really interesting to me is that, there's not this hero, and it's this accident of like, oh, this person happened to be there to help her, give her a hand up, but there was no plan. It was just they were thrown together, and I don't know, it's just really interesting. And then Dr. Susan Rowland's books, and after all her intellect, big brain, and all these academic books, now she's writing fiction. And
Hmm.
she has a series, and it's this three of women detectives who are accidental detectives. Like the former police chief is like, you guys don't know what you're doing, but they always solve everything. And one of them is a survivor of sex trafficking. And so they all like represent these, misfits, these people who are seen as other, but yet we need the other. The other is mirroring back to us that I have the experience that you all need for us to get out of this. So anyway, so just throw that out about, your thoughts about creativity and what's going on, and even your creativity. You're kind of doing the same thing. Now, there's a lot of depth psychologists, I think, that are writing They're writing fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing
My,
about depth psychologists, writers, is we know like we don't know exactly why and how we're doing it. Like we automatically know our unconscious is sort of driving us, so we're a little less attached to the ego, not totally, but we know there's like this mystery and that something is trying to work itself through us to create something. So,
there was when I independently published my novel Soul Mapper last year in 2023. um, it deals with some of the issues that we're talking about. Um, I almost used an old Gnostic saying. I like to use a little epigram at the beginning of my fiction, something along the lines of the separation of masculine and feminine is the beginning of death.
mm,
So that almost became the motto of the book. Um, and there's another one I was tempted to use that comes from an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin. Everything now depends upon the people of no account.
oh, oh, that's so good.
She would have loved all this. She totally got it, and those of us who kind of use her as a mentor are doing our best to follow up. But the first novel I wrote, the protagonist is somebody who's been forced his whole life to be in the hero role, and it's toxic for him. And so part of the struggle as he goes on a journey of individuation is to escape the role of the masculine hero.
Mm,
And yet to show up, he feels completely masculine all the way through. It's the role that's toxic.
yeah.
So he has to be a man in his own way. And so part of what the book's about is that. Part of it is how are we going to deal with the fact that in 50 or 60 years, climate chaos is going to be probably 10 times worse than it is right now. We just had a month-long heat wave in California. So, what will individuation require us to do, not only to survive, but to be whole and to work together? So those are questions that interest me in the fiction that I write. Um, I published the second novel, Heartlander, a couple of months ago, and different protagonist, and also a kind of a journey, but more of a visionary one.
Mhm.
And then I'm working on the third one right now, which is called Lamplighter. And in this one, in my imaginal space, there was a woman who is a spiritual teacher who popped up a few years ago. Her name is Miriam, and she's Palestinian. She came to the U.S. This is all 50 or 60 years from now. She came to the U.S., ended up in New York City, started a religious movement, kind of inadvertently, and her story is seen through masculine eyes. There's all kinds of reasons for male authors like me to not try to pretend to have a feminine perspective.
Yeah.
And so there's a man who admires her, but also understands that she's human and has human struggles. And so he's telling the story. But she's really the protagonist. So we'll have to see where that goes. I just started on that one.
Well, I'm gonna have to have you back just to talk about your books. Oh man, you're pumping those out. Do you feel swept up? Like, do you really
Yeah.
feel like your unconscious is like,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
then you
This
can't stop. You have to do it.
this also this mess in Gaza, this the latest of many times where
Mm.
Gazans have been oppressed and the violence and everything else, right? So this figure of Miriam came into my imagination about a year before all that got going,
Oh, wow.
and she's from that neck of the woods. So I was starting to take notes on this before that broke out, and that's the case a lot of times with those of us who write fiction. We're kind of onto something. With Tolkien, it was he was actually in one war, but he was writing themes that showed up in the Second World War before it ever was on the horizon. So
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. Well, think about those people who are futurists.
yeah,
They're very in touch with, the collective unconscious. How do they know some of the things? They might have strategies that they think that they're using, but they're in touch with something. And Soul Mapper, I'm going to share links to your books, of course, too, but I like how you describe this men being trapped in a role. So I think there's growing compassion for the patriarchal wounds that men carry. and there's space now being made, the work of Gender Equity and Reconciliation International and all that work, and even a workshop that I've always had, like compassion for men having to adjust to, not like, no, compassion for the difficulty of having to adjust, right? So when I was, taking my power, what does that mean? That throws men off. So not to excuse any bad behavior or anything, but really that, their wound is almost more sinister because they get their sense of masculine identity from oppressing and controlling and being a certain. So, what do women do to heal? They just have to fight back, do what they want. It's almost more fun than healing the masculine patriarchal wound. They have to redefine what it means to be strong. And to be strong means to be vulnerable, to have deep connection. And that's what is very frightening. I mean, I have lots of male clients. That's in there. Many of them have different versions of trying to reconnect with their feminine, and many of them are actually aware of that. But like my session today with somebody, we got to this place and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's about your father, not your literal father, but reconnecting with your archetypal father. Oh my God, of course you're not going to be able to reconnect with your feminine until you do that. I mean, it's just like, I didn't get it until today. We both like came to this place and he's like, yeah, yeah, that's it. So, because the father, the masculine, is not bad. It's just what we've done to the sons. So their wound is almost harder to heal because they have to do what's perceived to be weak, where women had to do what was perceived to be not their role. That's hard. So
There's,
anyway,
there's a little twist to this too in terms of male privilege, because one of the things we're raised to think is that ours is always the most important conversation going on.
yeah.
That even when we're in a group that's mostly women, we're the ones who count. We put ourselves right in the center, and there's exceptions to this, but that's generally what the condition says. So a tricky part is to be able to teach us not to do that anymore and to shut up and listen when we need to, but at the same time to still retain the capacity to speak up when we need to. And it
Oh.
can be difficult to negotiate.
Well, think about when men don't speak up. So that makes me think of my colleague, Dr. Sean Miller, who studies sexuality through a philosophy lens, and the research that shows that men overestimate the sexism of the men around them.
Yeah.
So they're wrong. So here they're equality men. Yes, they believe in women's equality. They're not threatened, but yet they can't fully be who they are because they assume the men around them are more sexist and will belittle them when they're wrong. So yeah, so speaking up in that way, like speaking up to be like, well, what? Of course I'm a feminist, right? Without fear. Oh my God, it's men that oppress men almost
Sure.
more than women.
And that feeling of overestimation comes from somewhere. That comes
Yeah.
from
It's
countless times
manufactured.
as boys. Well, it comes from when we're boys and we get shamed by other boys, or we
Oh,
get shamed by other or by women or whoever it is, right? So there's
right.
there's an actual core of trauma there that when you get older results in this misperception, I think.
Oh, because it's risky. It's risky. You're going to be literally punished. Yeah, see, I can't speak to men's experience. I just listen to men talk about it like you listen to women. And it's beautiful because we can honor both our wounds.
Yep.
So anyway, well, I love this conversation and it was super exciting because it just clashed with current events and that never happens to me. So I love it. So I think there'll be a lot of interest. So before we go, where can people find you? How do they support you? Where do they find your books? I think you have ways for people to engage in community with you. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, the easiest way is to go to my website because everything else is consolidated there. So it's my last name. It's chalkwist.com. And there's links there to my books. There's links to social media that I'm on. Right now I'm on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. What else am I on? LinkedIn, a couple of others. But that's probably the easiest thing to do, to just go to my website.
That sounds fantastic. And I can't wait to have our future chat.
Me
So,
too. Oh, I should mention one other thing too. I'm just now starting a Substack, and I
oh,
want it to be kind of a world or a realm or a space for people who like my fiction, so that we can talk about sort of the backstory of where it comes from. And that my reason for doing it independently is because I want other people to be able to make creative use of the characters and settings and all that without having to worry about copyright and trademark and all that mess that comes up when you do this through a retail publisher.
Oh my gosh.
I like
That
people to play with my characters and just come up with their own stuff.
that is so in the spirit of reconciliation. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for asking me back. This was great.
Yeah. So I hope you all enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Craig Chalquist, and it inspires you to consider a different way of looking at what's going on, and not with finger pointing, but with deeper understanding. And I hope this gets listened to by people from across the spectrum. So I hope that we've created a safe space in this conversation to just focus on dynamic and the deeper meaning of healing without, without making people feel bad about themselves. So yeah, so until next time.